All right, so I am fortunate enough to be the last speaker on the last day of a Friday to talk about the exciting field of regulatory, especially in developing countries. So I'm going to try to actually talk about regulatory and maybe throw some additional thoughts into my presentation that we've heard over the last couple of days. So just bear with me. I've modified this a bit since I've heard some of you speak yesterday. So the topic, I've changed the topic a little bit. So I added the word everyone's contributions, because it's not just donor contributions. And I think, we heard yesterday about non-communicable diseases, and the Gates Foundation pays very little attention or spends very little money on non-communicable diseases. But the work that we're doing in regulatory actually is the tide that raises all the boats. And this will affect all the products that these countries are going to get, even in the non-communicable disease area, which could be even have greater impact than what we're doing in the communicable disease area. The other word that I really like in here is the word sustain. And I'll just share a little bit. When I started at the Gates Foundation 4 years ago, we didn't have specific teams like integrated development. We had disease area teams, and each one of these teams, when they had a product, would work with a variety of different agencies to try to get that product approved. And it was typically successful, but at the end of the day, there was nothing sustained that was left behind. And I think that was one of the things that we really tried to think about. And the other area, when I started looking at where we were spending our money, we were spending money on capacity building. And that whole word always puzzles me. What is capacity building? And well, we're trying to build capacity in this agency or that agency or the other agency. And it was like, okay, well, to what end? Because, as Jürgen mentioned, if you look across these different countries, sometimes you may only have a handful of people in the regulatory agencies. So to think that if you're going to work in sub-Saharan Africa and you're going to have 50-some countries all develop competent regulatory agencies within our lifetime is probably not true. So I think, what we've tried to do is rethink, what does it mean to be sustainable? And I'll walk you through some of the work that's been done, and Rajiv mentioned Vincent Ahonkai, and Vincent's been just a pillar in this area, and I'm going to share some of the results of the work that Rajiv has mentioned. All right, so I think the button, is it on? All right, so part of this too is we wanted to look at it from as we think about our contributions and what does regulatory mean. And we spend well over $1 billion in R&D every year, so that's a lot of money. And so when we think about regulatory, it really fits nicely into this. So the only reason, the only lens that I typically have is the lens of impact. And when I work with our teams at the foundation, it really boils down to this simple sentence, is that we want the greatest impact in the shortest period of time with the least amount of human and financial resources. And when you think about what's going on in the regulatory system, we apply the same lens, and you'll see how this might play out in a couple slides. So there's all kinds of different areas you can focus on in the regulatory space. So you can look everywhere from discovery and development through registration and licensure to delivery and surveillance. And we decided that we would really start playing in the registration and licensure place first. We've done a little bit of work in the clinical trial area, and in fact, our work with a group called AVREF was one of the main reasons that clinical trials could actually be conducted during the Ebola crisis, because the countries that were most affected had essentially no regulatory system in place, and some of the countries had never run a single clinical trial. So it was really some of the work here that helped pay off. And then Rajiv also mentioned about pharmacovigilance or surveillance. So once you have a product, what are you going to do with that? And that's another area that we're starting to pay attention to. And so this just kind of shades it out in terms of where we started. We're kind of branching into some of these other areas. And we also, at the Gates Foundation, we've split our regulatory into systems and programmatic work. And we think the systems part is critical, and I'll spend most of my time on that. But on an individual product level, I think it's also critical. So I worked in pharma industry for almost 20 years, and to be honest with you, without my knowledge of the last 4 years, I would have no idea how to register a drug in most of the developing countries. And when we work with whether it's product development partners or other grantees, and they're working with multinational companies, what I'm seeing is that even though the multinational companies have great regulatory agencies and these amazing efficiencies, they have no idea how to get drugs efficiently registered in the areas that we want them. And so we have a programmatic strategy team that works with these folks to try to say, how do we do this in the least amount of time, or in the shortest period of time with the least amount of resources? So looking at the process, so this is the world that I used to live in, where it's really nice, okay? It's all boxed in. This is Lou's world, right? So it goes from a product, and it goes through a nice regulatory agency to a licensed prescriber and a practitioner, and then we get it. So it's a closed, highly regulated system that helps assure that we get quality products, and there's a great supply chain, and all that's just really wonderful. So you move into more of the developing world setting, and what you really have is a three-step process here. You have your first registration, then it typically goes through pre-qualification, and then it has to go through a national registration. And it was interesting when I started looking at this, I said, well, how long does that actually take? Because this was all new to me. And people were like, oh, it's a really long time. I'm like, well, how long is a really long time? Because I'm used to, kind of 9 to 12 months, 6 months if you have a little voucher. So nobody really knew what that looked like. So I'm going to walk you through what that actually looked like. And I'm not going to touch on the whole procurement delivery side, but we're starting to look at that as well, and I can tell you that's as scary as the registration part. So people in my world, in the development world, think once we get it registered, everything's just going to be great. Well, it's not. I can tell you that if you look at the vaccine delivery components of some of the products that are being produced, it's just scarily dismal. Okay, so maybe next year we can talk about that. So if you compare this to the nice controlled slide, and you can't even read this, and I don't expect you to read this, but this is the chaos that happens in some of the national regulatory agencies. There's a very loose system. There's a whole bunch of different ways that products can go from a manufacturer to a patient. And if you don't have a good regulatory system, what you're going to find is you're going to assure that products of uncertain quality, safety, and efficacy with insecure supply chains get out to patients. And if you're trying to do and make an impact in sustainable development goals with a system like this, it just won't happen, right? So there's estimates that somewhere between 30% of some of the malaria medicines are substandard or counterfeit. So how can you make a dent in malaria if a third of the medicines getting out may not even work, or may cause harm, or it may not have enough medicine in it, and then you lead to resistance. And so there's all kinds of huge implications to this. So when we started to look at how long it takes, we've used this little equation that we call from opinion to fact, and somebody mentioned yesterday about data. If you don't have data, you can't be serious. So I threw that in. So we go from opinion to fact to alignment to impact. So what does that look like? So the first thing that we had to do is we actually had to get data. And so went back. So we actually spent some time and some money to figure out how long does it take for a product, once it goes through its first registration, to actually get to the patient populations where we want them. And what we've seen is that the first approval, I think, is relatively standard. When we went to the PQ approval times, for medicines, it was great. It was 4 months, okay? But you look at medicines coming from NRAs or vaccines, you see these super long timelines. Well, then you look at what's the spread between the regulatory submissions, and you're looking at anywhere between 52 to 78 months, right? So these medicines that are originally approved and everybody, you have a party and everybody's really happy, well, they're years away from actually making a difference. And then once you get to sub-Saharan Africa, then you wait another year and a half, okay? So it was with this data that we could actually think through strategically, how can we make a difference in the system? And so we started thinking about the pre-qualification space, and really, if you think from a vertical perspective, you need process improvement, you need project management, and enforcing PQ standards in manufacturing countries. And then as you think moving across, you have to do something different to eliminate the spread and the approval times, and I think that's where the African medicines regulatory harmonization process really comes into play. So as we, our goal was to reduce this time frame by about 50%, and there's 3 main ways that we're doing this. So one is we needed to focus on value-added activities. So as you went horizontally across that system, every group that touched that was not adding new value. And so the whole concept of mutual reliance has been a key cornerstone in some of our work. We need to improve the manufacturer's input and just re-engineer that whole process. And I'll show you some data in just a second, where even if we're changing things in the PQ side, if the manufacturers aren't responding, the overall timelines aren't going to change as much as we want. And then we needed to decrease complexity, which is the third point. We needed to support harmonization, the process that Rajiv started with, and really think about regionalization and how can we pool resources together and think intelligently about capacity building and make it sustainable. So here at the top, and I know it may be hard to read in the back, but I think the good news is all of the timelines are starting to drop. And if you look at the one in the vaccine space where the longest timeframes were in the pre-qualification, and these are all just the pre-qualification, so the second column, if you will. In the vaccine space, the World Health Organization, just in the last 18 to 24 months, has already decreased the approval time by over 50%. So that's pretty dramatic. The overall timelines are about 33%. And across here, we're seeing about a 25% reduction in overall timelines. A lot of folks don't even know that there's something called the PQ NRA collaborative process. And this is a process whereby, right now I think we're at between 27 and 30 countries have agreed that if a product is pre-qualified, they'll approve it within 90 days. So 43 different medicines have gone through this process. They've been pre-qualified, and the time to approval in these 27 countries, the average time is 74 days. So you're thinking, this 4 to 7 year process, we've gone from talking about years to days. Another fun challenge that we picked up was the whole diagnostic space. And this was one of the more challenging areas, the whole issue of standards. There was multiple complexities involved with that. I think playing off the success in the drug and vaccine space, what you can see here is that gone from an average of 8 to 9 products being approved every year to last year 23, and this year likely even more. So this is actually starting to work, and I think this is huge for the Sustainable Development Goals, because without a system like this and without making these types of improvements, we're not going to hit them. So I just want to briefly touch on the African medicines regulatory harmonization process. So I've already mentioned, if you try to do country by country, the issues that are involved there, and I'm sure Rajiv and others that work at large pharma companies are going to have a real hard time prioritizing submitting 55 dossiers in sub-Saharan Africa with all of the other pressures that they have on them. So what we're trying to do, and I'll show you, I think successfully, is to create regions for regulatory harmonization around economic areas. And we've started in East Africa, and the data coming out of there is really quite impressive. We've started to move into West Africa, and I think by the end of the year, we'll actually have submissions running through the West Africa or the ECOWAS area. And then the Southern Africa and some of the other regions, I think based on the success of what we've seen in East Africa, are also starting to adopt this. And in January of this year, the African Union adopted model law that would allow all of the countries in Africa to utilize this regulatory framework. So these are huge advances. So just in the AMRH, it really started with an idea in 2009, and Rajiv was probably around when that happened. In 2012, we really kicked it off in East Africa, and this is a true partnership. There's a lot of different folks involved: WHO, NAPAD, the Gates Foundation, DFID, Gavi, Swissmedic, World Bank, and a whole bunch of other folks really coming together to try to make this happen. And with the whole goal of reducing the fragmentation that was involved, and to create a platform to build African regulatory capacity by region. And the formula that we've used is to create harmonized standards, joint regional reviews, work sharing, and pooling of resources, and streamlined decision-making processes. And this is just a very brief summary of some of the things that have happened. So from a regional product registration perspective in East Africa, what happens now is you put a single dossier in, and it will be reviewed by 6 EAC regulatory authorities. They've created 44 guidelines and harmonized them that are consistent with WHO and ICH. So this gets to the consistency point that Rajiv mentioned. The product categories include communicable and non-communicable diseases, and the assessment process is shortened through the reliance on previous stringent regulatory agencies or WHO pre-qualification. So this is the whole reliance and not redoing everything. At the end of last year, we did our first joint review of 8 dossiers. So Roche was one of the companies that agreed to put them through the process. And you can see these are actually oncology drugs that were put through, Avastin and Herceptin. It went through the process, and they were allowed to be marketed within 90 days of this process. So if you can imagine how long it would have taken them to do each dossier per country and 50 plus different areas, how long that would have taken. And the issues around the capability and capacity of the different agencies, again, I don't think we'd be talking about days. So I just want to end with this slide. What you've heard over the last 2 days is correct. And I think this is a great example of a successful partnership or successful partnerships. And it included all the things that folks talked about yesterday. So you have to build trust. So we would go into these situations and put everybody around the table, let people, tell us what's actually happening in their region, how we can work in their region. We started from a variety of different perspectives. We brought in ministers of health, ministers of finance, and I think we built the trust to actually allow these things to happen. From an alignment perspective, if you look at the grant that we made to the World Health Organization pre-qualification, it wasn't your typical grant where you had objectives 1 through 6 and some vague timelines. I mean, it was super, super detailed. But what it did is it drove alignment. And then we took it to the countries, and the countries bought in. everything was very, very transparent. What I love about the PQ Diagnostic team today is almost everything they do goes up on their website. And I think it's that level of transparency, again, that's one of the key drivers to build trust. Clarity, we have clear goals and they're very measurable. So these are one of the things, and I think playing off the marriage analogy yesterday, you know, we've tried to approach this with kindness, consideration, and even when pointing things out that need to be corrected, we've tried to apply those things. So I hope that this has been not just an example of regulatory, but an example of great partnerships. Thanks.